There was a tragic series of murders in Michigan. In this case, there were a total of 7 female victims. The youngest victim was only 13 years old, and the oldest was only 23. They were in the most hopeful and promising stage of their lives, yet they were murdered by a serial killer. This case took place in the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti of Michigan. It began in 1967 and ended in 1969. Although the time was brief, but its cruelty was shocking. Before they were killed, all 7 victims were severely beaten, and the remains of several of them were even dismembered. The victim of the first murder was named Mary, an accounting student at Eastern Michigan University. In order to improve her skills, 19-year-old Mary began working part-time while studying. On the evening of July 9, 1967, because the weather was too hot, Mary told her roommate she needed to go out to get some fresh air. An hour later, Mary finished her walk around campus and slowly made her way back to the apartment. However, she didn't notice that a blue-gray Chevrolet was closely following her. As Mary passed one streetlight after another, the Chevrolet pulled up beside her. A young man leaned out of the car window and spoke, inviting Mary to go for a drive and later have a drink at his place. Mary didn't say anything, she just shook her head, declined the invitation, and continued walking toward the apartment. On September 27, 1846, a supernatural story spread through the town of Superior in Washtenaw County. It was known as the Dixboro Ghost and involved 2 murders. On August 7, 1967, the body of a woman was discovered in an abandoned farmhouse in this town. Without waiting for news story, the victim was identified as Mary through dental records. The attacker's methods were extremely brutal. Mary's chest and abdomen were stabbed dozens of times. Her fingers and feet were also severed. Based on witness testimony, the police think that Mary had been raped, but the severely decomposed state of the body erased all the evidence. 2 days later, Mary's body was taken to the funeral home. Soon, a handsome, dark-haired young man drove an old, blue-gray Chevrolet to the funeral home. He found the receptionist, said that he was a friend of Mary's, and wanted to take some photos of her as a memento before the funeral to give to Mary's parents. However, due to the relevant regulations, the receptionist refused his request. The man then tried to persuade the receptionist, saying, "You mean you can't fix her up enough so I could just get one picture of her?" But the receptionist noticed that the man didn't even have a camera, so she firmly refused his request again. As time moved to July 5, 1968, nearly a year had passed since Mary's murder. The police still hadn't found the attacker when another murder happened. Several construction workers found a female body by the roadside in the Ann Arbor, with a miniskirt wrapped around her neck. The victim of this murder was Skell, a 20-year-old art student who also attended Eastern Michigan University. She had been stabbed dozens of times and her throat was slashed, with injuries of varying degrees in other parts of her body. Initially, the police think that Skell had been dead for a long time because her upper body was in a state of decomposition. However, after the forensic experts arrived at the scene for inspection, although her head, shoulders, and chest had rotted, there were no signs of decomposition below her waist. Therefore, Skell's time of death was confirmed to be around July 1st. Moreover, there was no blood at the crime scene, which suggests that after the attacker sexually assaulted and killed the girl, he most likely buried Skell below the waist in the soil while left her upper part exposed to the air. Then, around July 4th, he moved her body to the roadside. On the evening of June 30th, Skell told her roommate, Susan, she was going to Ann Arbor to visit her boyfriend. Because it was late, she was a little afraid and hoped that Susan could accompany her to the bus station. Although they hurried there, they still missed the last bus. Since there was no other option, Susan began to persuade Skell to give up her plan to go to Ann Arbor. However, Skell insisted on visiting her boyfriend and told Susan that she planned to hitchhike. After minutes of waiting, a red and black Pontiac Bonneville pulled up beside the 2 girls. The driver got out of the car and asked, "Hey, you want a ride?" The man had worn a green Eastern Michigan University t-shirt, was about 6 feet tall, looked to be in his 20s, had short dark hair. In addition to the driver, there were 2 white men in the car. Susan felt afraid and quietly tried to dissuade Skell from getting into the car. Although she hesitated for a moment, Skell agreed to the driver's invitation, but she also promised Susan that she would call her once she arrived safely in Ann Arbor. But even after more than 2 hours, Susan still hadn't heard from Skell. So at 1:47 a.m. on July 1st, Susan reported Skell's disappearance to the police. The police connected the various clues and first prepared to interrogate Skell's boyfriend. However, the man was found to be absent without leave from the army. This also explained why this girl had chosen to hitchhike to Ann Arbor late at night to find her boyfriend. After 2 months of investigation, 2 witnesses revealed important information to the police. At around midnight on July 1st, they saw Skell and a young man walking along the roadside. Although they were unsure whether the man was the attacker, they knew that he was named John and was a 21-year-old student at Eastern Michigan University. When questioned by the police, John denied knowing Skell, insisted that on June 29th and 30th, he and his mother were in Detroit. He didn't return to Ypsilanti until the morning of July 1st, and then the police didn't verify the authenticity of this information, immediately ruled out John as a suspect. The victim in the third murder was found in a cemetery in Van Buren Township, Wayne County. On March 20th, 1969, a 23-year-old student named Louise, who was studying at the University of Michigan, posted a handwritten note on a bulletin board on campus. It said her name, dorm room number, phone number, and her desire to hitchhike to Muskegon. The reason she wanted to go to Muskegon was that she wanted to share some good news with her family because soon she would get engaged to her boyfriend and was about to move to New York City. However, on the morning of March 21st, Louise's body was found with a copy of the anti-war satirical novel Catch-22 lying beside her. The autopsy determined that Louise died around 3 a.m. on March 21st, with the cause of death being 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Although Louise was not sexually assaulted, her tights were deliberately pulled down, exposing her thighs and sanitary napkin, indicating the attacker's potential sexual motive. While people were still reeling from the shock of this murder, on March 25th, a surveyor found the body of a young woman on a wooded hill, only about 400 yards from where Skell's body had been found. The crime scene was almost too gruesome to look at. The girl had been severely beaten with a blunt object, her skull crushed. An investigator said sadly that it was the most severe injury he had seen in his 30 years as a police officer. Afterwards, the deceased was identified as 16-year-old Skelton, who went missing on March 22nd, while waiting for a friend to pick her up at the McKinney Union at Eastern Michigan University. Since Skelton was just a high school student and a drug user and dealer, people initially suspected that her murder was drug-related. But the manner of her death was strikingly similar to that of the previous victims, including a garter belt wrapped around her neck and her clothes and shoes neatly placed beside the body. As a result, Ann Arbor Police Chief formally linked this murder to the Michigan murders. In addition, police from several different jurisdictions involved in the kidnappings or disposal of the victims' remains formally consolidated the information they had in an effort to compare notes and identify a suspect. 20 investigators were also assigned specifically to investigate these 4 murders. And, apart from witness leads and forensic reports, the police hardly found any physical evidence. However, less than a month after Skelton's murder, a 5th victim was found on a desolate road in the Ypsilanti area. Although the girl was only 13 years old, the harm and torment she suffered were still terrible. She had multiple stab wounds to her chest, abdomen, and thighs. A 2-foot-long black electrical cord was wrapped around her neck, and a handkerchief had been stuffed into her mouth. The police checked local records of missing girls and found that the victim was named Dawn. The day before her body was found, Dawn was playing at her friend's house. Because the road home was rather remote, Dawn and a friend named Kid decided to walk home together. At around 7:30 p.m., Kid took a different road, while Dawn continued walking along the railroad tracks. When she reached an abandoned farmhouse, the girl encountered the attacker. The farmhouse was the first scene of the murderer's attack on Dawn, as the police found fresh bloodstains, Dawn's sweater, and a black wire of the same type inside. According to the procedure for complex cases, the police usually conduct multiple inspections of the crime scene. However, as a means of taunting the police, the attacker returned to the farmhouse a week after the crime and left a piece of cloth and a gold earring belonging to Skelton there. On May 13th, the farmhouse was burned down, and the attacker placed 5 lilac flowers evenly along the road leading to the farmhouse. Despite receiving hundreds of leads, the police investigation into the Dawn case was no closer to the truth than with the first case. 21-year-old Elizabeth was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. Someone saw her dancing with a man with long hair at a friend's party. After leaving the party, Elizabeth disappeared on her way back to her apartment. No one noticed whether the girl left the party with the man with long hair. The next day, 3 boys found Elizabeth's half-naked body in a field near another abandoned farmhouse. The autopsy revealed that the girl had been sexually assaulted, had a gunshot wound to her forehead, and had stab wounds of varying severity on other parts of her body. When claiming his daughter's body, Elizabeth's father was devastated. He said, "I don't want her body. I want her alive. I'm not here to claim her body, and I won't claim it. I raised her with all my efforts and sent her here to study. I don't want her to die." All 6 victims were dark-haired white women. Their remains were placed by the attacker in locations that were easy to find. Each victim had a piece of clothing tied around her neck, and all were in their menstrual period when they were killed. Initially, before Elizabeth was murdered, the police believed that one attacker was responsible for only 4 of the murders, and that Louise might have been killed by another attacker. With Elizabeth's death, the police reached the final conclusion that one attacker was responsible for all 6 murders. But the occurrence of the 6 murders was already unsettling. Learning that these cases were all committed by the same attacker, the whole community fell into an unprecedented panic, especially the female students living in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, as the serial killer might very well be lurking nearby, disguised as some friendly classmate. To cope with this suffocating threat, they spontaneously established a buddy system. They would not go anywhere alone unless accompanied by a trustworthy male friend or at least 3 female friends. The once common practice of hitchhiking was also abandoned, as no one could determine where the potential danger might be lurking. On July 23, 1969, Karen, a student at Eastern Michigan University, went out to buy a wig and was reported missing when she did not return to her dormitory on time. Worried that the worst might happen, the police worked day and night to find her, but to no avail. The wig shop owner was the last person to see this girl. She overheard Karen saying that she had done 2 foolish things in her life, buying a wig and accepting a ride on a motorcycle with a stranger. She then left the wig shop on a motorcycle with a young man, and from that point on, the 18-year-old girl disappeared completely. On July 26th, Karen's body was found. Like the other victims, this girl had been severely beaten and tortured. This time, the police learned their lesson, considering that the attacker might have returned to the scene frequently and moved the victim's body for sexual ritual purposes. They first blocked the news to prevent the media from exposing the information, then secretly removed Karen's body and left a mannequin at the scene. On the early morning of July 27th, it was pouring with rain. A police officer, enduring the heavy rain and the irritation of insects, quietly kept watch at the crime scene. The visibility on the rainy night was extremely poor, so much so that the officer didn't see a man approaching the mannequin. It wasn't until the man fled that the officer saw him and tried to pick up the radio, which had already been damaged by the rain, to report the sighting. But as early as July 25th, a patrol officer named Larry provided an important clue. At first, he just listened to the wig shop owner's description of the man who rode a motorcycle with the victim, but he realized that the person she described might be his friend, who had previously been named a suspect in Skell's murder case by the police, but was later cleared of suspicion. So Larry found John, pretending to make small talk. He inquired about John's whereabouts over the past 2 days, and John inadvertently revealed that on the day Karen disappeared, he had indeed been riding his motorcycle in that area. Later, Larry located John's ex-girlfriend and obtained 2 photographs of John. He then showed these photos to the wig shop owner and her employees. However, both women firmly insisted that the man in the photos was the one who had ridden away with the victim on the motorcycle. On the afternoon of July 27th, despite being constantly criticized by the media for letting the suspect escape, the police directly located the apartment that John shared with his roommate, Davis. During the communication, John insisted that he was being framed and that the witness identification was mistaken. Even though taking a polygraph test at the police station could prove his innocence, John still refused. The next evening, Davis saw John take out a pair of women's purple leather shoes and a wallet and put them into a box wrapped in a blanket. He then took the box and left the apartment. 30 minutes later, John returned to the apartment. Davis curiously asked whose things they were. John said he had just decided to throw away the box and its contents. On July 29th, David, John's uncle, and a state police officer ended his vacation and returned home with his family. Then, David's wife noticed many new paint marks on the basement floor, and several items were missing, including a bottle of ammonia, a box of laundry detergent, and a can of black spray paint. On the same day, the police also informed David that his nephew had become a suspect in the Michigan murders and that there was circumstantial evidence against John. For example, after digging into John's background, they found that John had a special connection with the victims of several murders. Mary and Skell were John's neighbors. Dawn was the neighbor of one of John's ex-girlfriends, and John often visited Skelton's apartment a few months before she was murdered. Moreover, they questioned John's colleagues and learned that John often described in detail to his female colleagues the injuries sustained by each victim in the Michigan murders, injuries that even the media did not know about. John said that David had provided him with these details, but upon hearing this, David pointed out that he had not revealed any information about the Michigan murders to his nephew. The next day, David scraped off the new paint in the basement and found the floor underneath covered in stains resembling human blood. So he immediately returned to the police station and reported his discovery. He stated that before he and his family went on vacation, he had let John stay in his house to look after his dog. The paint could only have been applied by John. That afternoon, the police searched the basement of David's house, where John was also there. Initially, when the forensic experts determined that the stains were not human blood, John burst into tears. He then calmly denied ever having seen Karen. However, later the forensic team did find blood in several other areas and discovered some hair and blood near the washing machine. When asked about the origin of the hair, David pointed out that his wife often cut the children's hair in the basement. What David didn't know was that Karen also had some strands of hair of the same length in her underwear. After sending the hair and blood to the laboratory, the hair found in Karen's underwear matched the hair found in the basement, and the blood also matched Karen's blood type. David's neighbors also provided clues, saying that they heard a woman screaming from David's house on the day Karen went missing. On August 1st, the police arrested John on suspicion of murdering Karen and thoroughly searched his apartment and vehicle. Upon inspection, they found blood and hair inside John's silver gray Oldsmobile Cutlass. A day later, police in California found the officers who had arrested John and informed them that John was also responsible for the death of a girl named Phillips. So, 2 police officers from Washtenaw County traveled to California to review information and confirm whether there was a connection between Phillips' murder and the murder John was suspected of committing in Michigan. As a result, they found that on June 29th, Phillips had told a close friend that she had met a student named John from Eastern Michigan University who drove a silver gray Oldsmobile Cutlass and was temporarily living with a friend in a camper trailer. Further investigation into John's whereabouts revealed that on June 21st, John and his former roommate Andrew drove to Monterey and rented a camper trailer. Phillips went missing on June 30th, and her body was found on July 13th. Similar to the victims in the Michigan murders, Phillips suffered similar stab wounds and had a piece of clothing tied around her neck. After comparing the case records, the police officially announced to the public that John was the murderer who killed Phillips. On August 19, 1970, the jury found John guilty of murdering Karen, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, even after hearing the verdict, John remained unmoved, despite his mother and sister leaving the courtroom in tears. Additionally, in response, John stood up from his chair and said, "I have 2 things to say. I believe they have done their best to give me a fair trial, and the jury has not taken their duties lightly. However, I believe the situation has been exaggerated, and I cannot receive a fair trial. What has happened in this courtroom is a mockery of justice, and I hope it will be corrected one day. Second, I have never met a girl named Karen. I have never spoken to her. I have never taken her to the wig shop. I have never taken her to my uncle's house, and I have never taken her life." John initially served his sentence at the Michigan State Prison and was transferred to the Marquette Branch Prison in 1977. In 1979, John attempted to escape from prison. He and 6 other inmates dug a tunnel more than 19 feet long and 2 feet wide beneath the prison. However, just 25 feet short of freedom, the guards caught them.